This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry about that.
In the reading the material that you sent us, is that I found that my European students were harder for me to get engaged with Milton than my Zulu students, who actually, they really took it at a very personal level, and they had a different take, especially on what Adam's response to Eve when she comes back with the fruit and what he should have done. Because a number of the European students were saying Adam he should have rejected her, he should never taken the fruit from her. But my Zulu students were all saying, no, absolutely, he had to do this. He could not, and I said, even though it means he's going to die, and even though it means that all of their children are going to be cursed, he said, it was very clear to them that it was the two human beings against the powers that be, and that you had to stick with your family.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's Milton. I mean, Milton is, if anything, more alienating in terms of his difficulty to a non-native speaking audience than Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And he's not performed, so it's difficult to get an idea from watching a performance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A couple of colleagues who teach Milton here at WITS focus on him as I suppose you could say, a political polemicist, and so they'll teach Areopagitica or Milton as prose writer rather than as poet, but in addition to provide a different perspective on it.
I was very impressed with WITS. I mean, I was used to Peter Maritzburg, and they were much more desultory about their educational mission, and it just seemed like they were going to university, but not really. And at WITS, there was a high intellectual culture and a lot of intellectual energy among the students and the faculty that just wasn't there at that time. I'm sure things have changed now in Peter Maritzburg.
Yeah.
But a friend of mine here, who's from South Africa, Neville Hode, he called Peter Maritzburg Sleepy Hollow.
I guess like a couple of university towns in South Africa, it's for students that it's sometimes slightly cut off from the big wide world. I mean, I went to University at Rhodes in Grahamstown, which is also a small university town. I suppose it means that there's that awkward town versus gown distinction. And it also means that if you think about the town outside of the university, then sometimes it's, it kind of creates a bit of a bubble effect.
Yeah, it was a nice visit. It was an eye-opening visit to Johannesburg for me, at any rate. It was I hadn't been in such a big, exciting, but also dangerous place. At that time, it seemed dangerous. Lots of security guards all around all the time.
It's still big and exciting and dangerous. Probably bigger and more exciting and more dangerous.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So years ago, yeah.
These people in these big houses would have signs saying, "Armed response security." It was that kind of like, don't mess with us because we'll shoot,
Yeah. I suppose
and all
when
these private security companies going around.
Yeah, you almost.
I guess Derrida had been there a few years before, and he had been mugged. So people were telling me that, don't walk to school from where I was staying. Don't walk to school because you might get mugged, like Derrida did.
It's not the thing that you want to have in common with him, is it?
That's exactly. That's the only thing I would have in common with Derrida. All right. So let me go ahead and I'll ask Reagan to start. Come up here and look into the camera and introduce yourself to Chris and let him know what plays you've been reading. Can you do that?
Get the blood going,
Huh?
Get the blood going, walk around.
And then after we're done introducing what we've been doing, Chris will be talking to us about Shakespeare in South Africa. So the camera, I think, is right there. Chris, this is Reagan. Reagan, this is Professor Thurman. Sorry, I should be more dignified. Professor
No,
Thurman.
no, Chris is fine.
Okay, then John's fine too.
All right, good morning. My name is Reagan, as he said. I believe we started with Ovid, with Venus and Adonis. And then we went into Measure for Measure, Titus Andronicus, Midsummer Night's Dream,
Good.
Antony and Cleopatra, and right now we are currently in As You Like It with our pals in Ecuador who are taking like an ecological look at it.
Yes. That's a nice.
Okay, good, Reagan. Thank you. Emily, come on up. Maybe you can give them, give Chris the history of our connections, who we've been connecting with, and Reagan talked about Ovid and ecology and how that's separated out into our two connections, maybe.
Yeah, so we met with, at the beginning of the semester, we were communicating with a class in Montpellier, France, while they were taking an approach of like connecting Shakespeare to like his sources, so like Ovid. As you mentioned, like we read Venus and Adonis, and we also talked about like a couple other plays that connect.
A lot of time with Midsummer Night's Dream and Ovidian.
Yeah, like Midsummer Night's Dream and like talking about Pyramus being there. And right now we're working with a class in Ecuador, which is their class is not a Shakespeare class, it's like literature and ecology class, and most of them are like majoring in science and looking at it from that perspective. So we've been learning a lot about that because I think we're mostly liberal arts majors who we don't usually take that kind of approach to the literature.
Thank you. Now, Camille, come on up. Oh, come on, you can do it, please. I want you to like introduce some of the themes we've been talking about in the last few weeks, in particular, in relation to As You Like It, maybe. Like forest versus court and gender issues and things like that.
All right, hi.
This is Camille.
I'm Camille. So the past 2 weeks, we've been talking a lot about the difference between the first world and the second world, mostly related to As You Like It, and the difference between court life and the forest, the country life. So we talked about like how the court life was had a more like structured social system. Also, like their perspective of time was different. Also, the perception of gender we talked about.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about the particularly gender with the character of Rosalind,
right? And
dressing up as Ganymede and then pretending that she's Rosalind while she's talking to Orlando, and the kind of tension between them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How misogyny came so easily to her.
Yeah.
Well.
Okay, thank you, Camille. I know that wasn't easy. I appreciate it. Now I think we're all here now. So if you wouldn't mind, I don't know about the guys in Ecuador. Are they ready to come online?
I emailed, so we'll see. I reminded them an email just now.
Okay.
So
yeah, and I sent that email to Matt Dolloff, the same email I sent to you and to Chris last night.
Yeah. So we'll see. He knows that we're waiting for him.
Yeah, I was just hoping that what Chris had to say might be shared with them as well.
I think Matt would probably enjoy that.
He would probably like that, yeah.
So.
But I don't want to keep Chris on hold for too long. Maybe we could. Maybe you guys could just like, without me telling you what you're going to say, give Chris some sense of what you think this class has been about. At least insofar as it's been tying you up with people who are not from Texas. Because one of the things, I mean, you did a great job talking about Montpellier, for example, but one of the interesting things about Montpellier was just the diversity of the students in the classroom. And the same is true with Quito, right? It's not, we're starting to seem to be more homogenous here. But at any rate, we'll start with Cole and then we'll go to China.
Sure. We've been.
You can stand up and talk right into the camera.
Hey there. I'm Cole. Yeah, I guess one of the big things we've been doing is I think about this quote that we talked about in our first class that's from the general introduction to like the copy of Shakespeare that we have that says that Shakespeare is not for one time.
Slow down and loud.
He's for all time. And so, like an extension of that, we've been talking about how he's also for all places. So us interacting with people from like all over the world is interesting to see how like they interpret Shakespeare and like what it means to them and how they interpret it and what they're getting out of it as compared to like what we're getting out of it, especially because like some of my classmates said.
What would you say the difference has been between, say, the French students and their interest and the Ecuadorian students and their interests?
I've only gotten to meet with the Ecuadorian class one time, and unfortunately the audio is kind of gone, so I actually just learned.
Maybe we should let Shaina answer that one.
Can you repeat the question?
That's a good question, though, isn't it? Like, what was it like talking with the French people versus what's it like talking with the people from Ecuador?
Well, hi, my name is Shaina, and I guess the biggest difference is really just the perspective of the things we're studying, because I guess we're all in that mindset. So they talk a lot about the theme that I think Reagan brought up earlier about the difference between like civilization and nature, which is the thing we talked about a lot when we read *Midsummer's Dream*. The Ecuadorian class like talks about that a lot, but the French class.
They were more about like almost more like instead of talking about
just the fantasy.
Yeah, but also like how Shakespeare was relating to other places through texts, right? Not through. It's not like, okay, well, there's this place and then there's that place. It's more like there's Shakespeare and then there's Ovid and there's the Metamorphoses and then there's this play. It's more intertextual for the French kids anyway.
Yeah, and I think the French class is more like our class because we just were trying to find meanings and connections about like common themes and common like interpretations of the text that like connected to like us and to different works, like Ovid.
Yeah, they were really concerned with classical backgrounds, and I think that's fairly characteristic of the French. That they do a lot of intellectual history and literary history, and even philosophy, and how it informs the play as they're doing a very close reading of the text. Oh, it looks like we're on with Ecuador now.
Are we the only class that's like connecting with like several other classes? Because like aren't we for most of these classes just the only one they're connecting to?
Yes.
So it's kind of like we're more focused on perspective, like the modern perspective, because like it's like a PICS class, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. We got more of a we're not looking backward as much as we are. We're looking at like how are people reading the same thing as we are right now around the world.
Right. So it's like our main focus.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good, Sean. Thank you. Anybody have anything they want to add to what Shaina and Cole said?
We haven't mentioned our acting yet.
What?
We haven't mentioned our acting yet.
Oh yeah, we haven't mentioned the acting at all, have we? And that's actually a really important part of the class, especially with the French. And we did a lot of performance, including the death scene of Cleopatra, which was our culminating performance. It was really great. With snakes on Cleopatra's breasts. It was great. I've had a lot of fun doing it. I don't know that all the students in the class appreciate performance, but the ones that were most involved, and I think it was fun. I mean, I don't know your secret minds, so I can't talk for you, but it seemed to me that we understood the play better by trying to internalize the speeches and perform them. I always do. I think that some people learn different models or different ways of learning, and what's easy for me isn't necessarily easy for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. You mentioned that because through a few quirks of the timetable and the curriculum and degree structure, we've had fewer and fewer of our students here at WITS who are theatre and performance majors or working in the School of Arts who also to take literary studies. And so more and more the students who are taking our classes are in our school, which is Literature, Language and Media. And there's been less kind of cross-pollination between performance studies and literary studies. And it's a great pity to me because I mean, what I admire from what I've seen of some of the projects and the programs at UT Austin is students who are not theatre majors are encouraged still to be involved in performing. And I think that's really the only way to really get to grips with the text, even if it means that we have to do that very self-consciously or without a strong sense of our ability as performers, but it certainly helps in the understanding.
Well, I think there is there used to be, at least in my own department, a little bit of a prejudice among more scholarly faculty against people who work through performance. But that's, I think, been relegated to the past.
Yeah.
The main, the group at Texas that does Shakespeare in performance, Shakespeare at Wyandotte, is led by a very reputable scholar. And these students are learning the text at the syllable by syllable, and in a very historically grounded way. Then it would be impossible for anyone to claim that they were somehow not understanding Shakespeare or not being rigorous in their study of Shakespeare. So it's we've been working with a Shakespeare outreach, because this is in part what we're doing is affiliated with Shakespeare at Wyandotte, which is why we've had a performance element in the class as well. And next week we're going to be connecting with a class in Hangzhou, China at Zhejiang University, and working on the assassination of Caesar. We're going to read Julius Caesar and trying to perform Mark Antony's funeral oration. Emily here has a lot of it memorized already because we have a memorization assignment in our class. So I think she's going to be a major player in that particular speech. I'm not exactly sure how that's all going to work out because we haven't had a chance to do any kind of rehearsing yet. But we're hopeful. I'm hopeful. Anybody else have anything they want to contribute? They have got something to say to Chris before we get going? Before he gets going? I'd love it if you did volunteer something, but that doesn't, I'm not trying to pull teeth either.
The prompting sometimes helps. I think the prompting sometimes helps, like.
The what?
The prompting that you give.
Yeah.
Instead of just coming up cold. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad something helped.
Well, I'm curious from the students here. I mean, the aspect of doing performance, of reading the lines and acting the scenes, I mean, does that help you have a better sense of the play's value or interpretation of its themes rather than simply reading it?
See, I'm afraid to ask that question because I'll think that they're going to think, since I've been making them do performance, they're going to feel like they have to say yes. And if people are honest about it in their journals, but I'm not sure that people are going to volunteer. I mean, I worry about the answers not being authentic.
Oh, I see.
But no, it's great. I'm glad you asked it. Right? So Matt asked the question, what do you think? And don't be afraid. Yeah, Camille.
I think if you just read the plays, you have a hard time understanding the emotional levels that each character is experiencing, because just reading it is just words on a page. But I think performing it, having someone tell you, giving you notes on how to perform it, makes you understand what the characters' motives are and how they feel.
Yeah, what's coming through the words,
the
right?
nuances of
Yeah.
But I do think that it has to be supplemented with reading it whole, because I think you have to get a whole understanding of the text to understand those individual parts and their context. So I think it's a good supplementally.
Yeah, it works that way for me. But not everyone is the same. Bethany, you had your hand up too.
I was just gonna say that I think, performing it is important, but I think reading it is important too, because I find that I don't know, when we just go off the performance, sometimes people or directors perform it a certain way, and that's not how I read it or how I interpreted it. And so seeing that is kind of it's interesting, but it's also a clash.
Isn't that useful though? To realize that people to recognize that people realize the same words in different ways, and the sort of the latitude that Shakespeare gives performers, which is, I think, actually a pretty good segue for Chris, because, the idea being that we got the same words on the page, but the way that students in South Africa might receive them or realize them might conflict with ours. And that's actually really useful to know that.
Yeah,
It's
that's
not
what,
comfortable to know that there's multiplicity, but it's really useful to know it's there so that you don't say, this is the way it is, which is, I mean, that's the way I was taught, you know? If you're gonna read this play, this is how it works. And what, you know, part of what this experience of teaching Shakespeare overseas and working through connections has made me a lot more aware and how legitimate is it for me to say, no, you're reading it, this is not right, you're not understanding what's going on here, it's going on this way. And I don't know that I have that authority. I mean, I used to feel like I had that authority, and I feel like it's really healthy for me to get pushback.
yeah, that's what I was just saying. I think it's good to watch. I just think it's also important to read it yourself. It's like same with like movies. If you go watch a movie and you haven't read the book, and then you go read the book, it's like, wow. So I'm just saying, like, yeah, like it's both of them are like
right. And I can understand preferring your own, like, this is for me, right? And that I like it this way. I get that. And I always felt that way when I was reading. I'd read a novel and then I'd go see the movie. I always thought it was inferior to the experience of reading. But I thought that was a pretty uncommon position to be in these days. No? Is that true for you guys too?
Yeah, books are usually better.
I think most people.
I think it kind of depends. Like, I think, yeah, it depends on like how
good the movie is.
Yeah, I lost my train of thought. So I was trying to think of an example of like something where the movie was actually like a little bit better. Because I know it's happened to me, like on occasion.
What are you saying, Seth?
The Shining is a better movie than the book.
The Shining is a better movie than the book, you think?
And I think every performance of Shakespeare movie is better than reading the book. Just saying, right? Like, I watched Tyson Andronicus, it's really cool. With Anthony Hopkins.
Did you watch Tyson Andronicus with Anthony Hopkins?
Really cool.
And you liked it better than the play, or?
I liked it better than reading it, which I think is probably true for most plays.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had that experience with Romeo and Juliet, actually.
Well, Shakespeare's, you're reading scripts. You're not reading a novel, right?
So it's
And that's
different
really
than
important
watching
to
the
remember.
performance and then watching the movie.
Yeah, because
The book is like
the
set
original
up
source
to be read.
material at,
And you can
like,
still take
4 years.
Shakespeare like not as good. Like when I was watching, when I was like memorizing Antony's speech, I was like watching like every like thing on YouTube I could find that was like his speech, and like there was like one guy who was doing it, and he like seemed like happy while he was giving the funeral oration. He's like, friends, Romans, countrymen, and I'm like,
Oh, really?
what? And because most of them are like yelling, like trying to calm down the crowd, and I was like.
Right, because he's dealing with crowd management, right? I mean, because Brutus has them at that point very much on his side, and Antony is Caesar's friend, and introducing himself as Caesar's friend to a crowd that thinks, it's a good thing this guy's dead because we've been rescued from tyranny. And here's Antony coming up. That's a challenge for him to deal with that.
Well, that's so interesting. I'm sorry, I'm jumping in here, but that you're mentioning, John, that you were taught to understand there's a proper way to enact the lines.
Right.
And we're saying now, well, it's interesting to trouble that way of reading, but then, based on what we were just talking about right now, it's interesting to say that we all have an intuitive kind of way of saying that's right, that's wrong. When I look at somebody who performs Antony this way, that's not right. But it's almost going by intuition more than the informed reading, or maybe there's some combination, you know.
But, you know, actually, I think maybe this is a good way to get, I want to have Chris give a little thumbnail of what's been going on in his experience in Africa teaching. But the first thing I remember reading about Shakespeare in Africa was was kind of like a humorous take on teaching Hamlet, and how bad Hamlet the prince was for not being more accommodating to his uncle Claudius after his father had died, and how he was behaving like an undutiful child, and that they were totally on Claudius's side. The readers in Africa that this anthropologist was writing about, and I don't know whether you have anything like it's as extreme as that. You know, like a reading that would seem to us to be maybe culturally at least outlandish, and yet would work. It would seem like more natural reading it from an African perspective or tribal perspective, I guess is what I really mean. Like my kids in reading Milton saying, no, Adam does exactly the right thing. He's got to have solidarity with Eve. that's more important than being right with these celestial powers. Chris, why don't you take it away?
Well, it's a vexed question. I'm just looking in the top right-hand corner of my screen. I'm not sure if you guys are there with Matt and some of his students coming in. I thought I'd say hello quickly. Morning, Matt.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Matt.
Oh, cool. Do you think maybe you could wait 5 minutes until my students get here at 8:30? Because I would love for them to hear what you have to say from South Africa.
Is that okay with you, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could talk about something else until 8:30, but
we can just continue our conversation, and Matt can pitch in, and you can pitch in, and the students seem to have a perspective on. They're more involved in this conversation than in some conversations. So maybe we can just talk in a kind of a loose way for 5 minutes until Matt's students arrive.
Well, I had some comments too.
Okay.
I always had my students act at the University of Tennessee. They acted all of them. And I really enjoyed it.
University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Is true that?
But anyway, I had students from all over the world too, and they did a wonderful job. But back to what you were saying, I mean, I guess you guys read Hamlet, and you know the famous scene is Mel Gibson actually making out with his mother, and that was a decision that they made for that movie. So also, if you see the BBC production As You Like It, I can't remember her name. She's a very famous actress, Rosalind. But she doesn't disguise her voice at all. She sounds like a mousy girl the whole way through, and it drives me insane. But what else can I say? I had Chinese students for the time, and they were so wonderful. We were doing Pericles, and they were flowers. Marina was picking flowers, and they made origami flowers out of, and they were all purple and yellow, and I was like, well, why are they all purple and yellow? And they just turned to me and said, because they are violets and marigolds. I was like, really? So we just learned a lot from the performance, and so do I too.
Can I say something? I was gonna say, I always think when
this is Seth.
Hi, Seth.
When we're doing performances or I'm thinking about it in a performance context, it almost seems like the thematic discussions you might have after reading the text are sort of like, don't seem as readily apparent to me. I think it's like a lot the same when you talk to writers about what they wrote and they're like, oh, were you trying to do this? And they're like, no. You know what I mean? I always wonder if Shakespeare really was as thematically thoughtful as we think he is, or if he was just sort of an incredible writer. And I feel like that comes out more in performance than when I'm reading the text, I guess.
I think it's a great observation, partly because Shakespeare's a really interesting test case for some of the basic theories we think of it as, I suppose, primarily in a literary studies context, but it's true of the arts more generally, around of intentional fallacy and the death of the author. In Shakespeare's case, we collate various character perspectives from different plays, and we formulate it into what we think of as Shakespeare's opinion. But in fact, when we try to grasp that, there's nothing there, right? You know a lot about Shakespeare graphically, much more than most people who lived at that time. But there's nothing like a manifesto or a Shakespearean set of principles. So I think it's very pleasing that you experience that in performance, because in a way it suggests that the text becomes not a template, but it becomes a mechanism to read the audience rather than the other way around. Sometimes I think performers, there have been some interesting experiments in South Africa over the last few years with ensemble performance and not quite trying to manufacture spontaneity, but getting actors to learn huge reams of text, sometimes across different characters, and then night by night checking roles, so that they're not thinking what they're doing and trying to convey a message with a particular line or speech, but allowing the words to guide them or direct them. And that seems to be something, along the lines of what you're describing, that sometimes we do a disservice to Shakespeare's plays or any text when we try and resolve it into themes. instead of having something closer to an immediate response, almost an intuitive response to the language as spoken.
Thanks. That's interesting.
You know, what you're talking about with, I was thinking about Hamlet, because with Seth's question and your response, Hamlet, you don't necessarily have to see him standing in for Shakespeare, but he gives advice to actors. And he's got some real attitude about actors who don't say the lines the way he wrote them, right? You know, speak the speech, I pray you, but trippingly on the tongue. Do not go sawing the air. I want you to, don't mess up my language. He does seem to be a little bit proprietary, but no, you can't say, okay, so it's not Shakespeare, it's a prince, but it's a prince that's talking about something that is, I mean, you can't say, oh, well, he thinks the same way as Hamlet does, even though I think scholars want to often try and do that. But it does seem as if there's some anxiety among authors, at least if Hamlet is any representative of authors, about how what they've written is being presented through performance.
That reminds me of Joel and Ethan Coen, those directors, whenever they're on set, apparently they'll do this sort of bit when somebody tries to improvise, they'll be like, Joel, was that the line? And Ethan will be like, no, I don't think so, Joel. And because they both write it together. And their movies are...
The Coen brothers?
Yeah. Their movies are extremely thematic, I think, or they seem to be pretty direct. Like, you can almost be like, this was about this, and this was about chaos, and this was about this.
Yeah, they're almost allegorical, right?
Yeah.
And I think, though that'd be the word term you're looking for, they can more like, this character isn't like so realistic as they are representative.
And stuff, yeah. So I wonder if Shakespeare, if he was the kind of person who made sure his lines were spoken a certain way, that makes me think maybe he was trying to be more precise than I'm giving him credit for.
But Hamlet is a graduate student, isn't that right? He's a student.
Yeah.
Hamlet.
Yeah. Yes. Right.
So
that's exactly right. And he's not just a student; he's a Protestant student, right? He's from Wittenberg, and he's trying to deal with a lot of challenges to his own. I mean, the point that Bethany brought up before is Hamlet is having to confront the possibility that things are way different than he thought they were, right? That's what, and he's thrown into doubt. I mean, he's paralyzed because he's dealing with things that are new to him, that challenge his worldview. Because if the ghost is real, then Protestantism is what he's been taught at Wittenberg is not the case. Are you all there, Matt, in South America?
Yeah, we're here. Most of the students are here. We're still waiting on an actual microphone. They're coming with it. I was thinking of a resource that your students might like. If you have it at the library, it's called Shakespeare Behind Bars. And it's a maximum security prison where they go in and teach them The Tempest. And they're dealing with a lot of these same issues here in America. So it's a really moving 90 minutes if you have a copy of it.
Okay, I think actually, Matt, your sound is coming through much better than it was our last class. Can you hear us pretty well?
Great. Yeah.
Can you hear Chris well also?
I'll test.
Yes, we can. Yeah, there's a little delay, but not bad.
Well, I'd like to have Chris give a little bit of a summary of what it's like in South Africa now to be teaching Shakespeare, what the situation is with Shakespeare studies there, just to give like an off-the-cuff series of remarks, because he's the new guy in the game, and I'd like to get his perspective. Is that all right by you?
Yeah, we'd love to hear it. Can you hear this microphone now?
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
we'll hear it. We're all here. We'll
so you're up, Chris. At last.
If this becomes an over-lengthy monologue, or if the feed starts to cut out, or I'm speaking too fast, just wave your hand so I know to stop. So, I mean, John had initially asked about a bit of institutional background specific to WITS. Maybe we can return to that question because it might relate to the way that my students and I are thinking about Shakespeare in Johannesburg today particularly, but perhaps we can talk in more general terms before we talk specifically about Wits and Joburg. So there's a vexed question around Shakespeare and curriculum in South Africa generally, and that applies to secondary schools, high schools, and to universities. I suppose the context in which that fits is a wider discussion around decolonizing the curriculum and thinking about the ways in which South African literary studies, cultural studies across the humanities, and in fact in various faculties have been shaped by colonial history and a colonial legacy that is often unconsciously adopted and reproduced in the way that we teach and the subjects we choose to teach. So Shakespeare is a kind of almost an extreme example of that because he seems so obviously to stand for aspects of the British imperial process and has been used and abused and exploited as a symbol of so-called British culture kind of exported around the world. And so paradoxically in South Africa, he has that stigma attached to his work at the same time as having a very interesting set of historical intersections with the struggle for political freedom in South Africa and the liberation struggle, particularly by Black politicians and activists and intellectual figures. So that contestation around Shakespeare historically is actually more about Shakespeare as a symbol than it is about the particular playtext. And so I find often when I'm teaching Shakespeare or when we're talking about Shakespeare, it's a meta conversation. It's not necessarily a conversation about the details in the plays so much as a conversation about Shakespeare's place in the conversation. So we can get ourselves into circles in that way. But that's the broader context that you should probably all bear in mind, is that obviously, there are arguments that can be made for and against Shakespeare's inclusion in the curriculum in any national or educational context. But it has a particularly fraught position in South Africa. And so people like me who are interested in Shakespeare as a socio-political phenomenon as much as a body of literary texts or dramatic works, tend to teach Shakespeare with the assumption that we always need to make Shakespeare, to use a dubious word, relevant or accessible, sexy. And I'm constantly surprised by my own students' reminded to me that what I think of as the things that make Shakespeare interesting are not necessarily what they think of as the things that make Shakespeare interesting. So there's a risk that in presenting my own interest in Shakespeare and the kind of material that I present to students, I'm not properly presenting to all of you something that represents both my students' perspectives and my own. So maybe if we can get the time zones right, or we can do some recordings, or before the semester is out for you guys and for us, we can connect you to my students who might say some different things to what I'm saying. But I guess there are two key points that I would make. The one is that when we think about Shakespeare in South Africa, an historical default has been to think about resonance between the plays and a South African, or maybe if you want to speak in slightly generalized or essentialized terms, an African context. And that can be very invigorating, but it also carries with it certain risks. So for example, John Carney, the famous South African actor, I'm sure many of you know John Carney. I almost feel like I should ask for a show of hands. If you've seen Black Panther, you've seen John Carney. So he famously said that Julius Caesar is Shakespeare's African play. And this gave license to some theatre makers at the Royal Shakespeare Company in the UK to make an Africanized Julius Caesar, as they called it, and has stimulated a lot of discussion around the play in South Africa. And likewise, people over the years have claimed that Macbeth speaks particularly strongly to a South African or African context. Othello, of course, is a play because of concerns around race that signifies potently in South Africa. And so we tend to have this collection of plays that we think of as very specific or appropriate to South Africa. And that's valuable because often my students do find those connections. Sometimes they have to do with religious belief, what I suppose some people would call supernaturalism or superstition, but to some of my students is not that. They might be to do with politics and people discerning a particular pattern in African politics, although again I have misgivings around that because South Africa doesn't quite fit a kind of post-colonial African pattern. And then there are other interesting connections that are made. So people will talk about Coriolanus as a play that makes sense in South Africa because our former president, Thabo Mbeki, like Coriolanus, was a man who was disdainful of the masses, disdainful of the people of South Africa, and that elitism earned him the rejection of the population. But as you were talking earlier, John, your class, about having studied Titus Andronicus, I thought it might be interesting to mention one of the most significant post-apartheid productions of Shakespeare in South Africa was a production of Titus Andronicus, where Anthony Sher, who's an expat South African, who's now Sir Anthony Sher on the British stage, and his partner Gregory Doran, who's currently the director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, came to South Africa and did some workshops with South African actors. And I suppose in a similar fashion to your experience, John, when they were in Joburg, they sensed it as a very dangerous, often violent place. And they started scouting around for plays that would match, and they settled on Titus Andronicus. And they made the claim in a book that they wrote about it that Titus Andronicus in other contexts seems like just a gory melodrama with this kind of excess of the spectacle of violence on stage. But in South Africa, it makes sense. And so that's potentially an appealing claim until you realize that what they did to try and make that play match South Africa as a kind of allegory, and I'm interested that you mentioned allegory earlier and the ways in which the plays can function allegorically, or maybe if we're thinking about the Coen brothers as presenting allegories in their films and the ways in which I don't quite think that works with Shakespeare in a South African context. What these two theatre makers did was they had to chop and change the script to match the South African pattern. And so the character of Aaron the Moor, who obviously has very eloquent lines expounding a kind of form of black consciousness. I guess black is better than another hue because it scorns to share another hue. People have written about echoes between Aaron's language in black consciousness and Steve Biko's work in the South African context. So that's very appealing, except of course that in Shakespeare's play, Aaron is an out-and-out villain and is left to be taken apart by the beasts of the field. And Titus Andronicus is not a play that ends with reconciliation after violence. And that would kind of...
We've lost sound for a second. We're on your side. No, we don't hear you yet. Can you hear us?
Connect, yeah?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Oh, good, thank you, sorry. It's probably a good thing that I was cut off because you can tell I'm passionate about these things. I'll mouth off about it for hours. But just in terms of your study of Titus,
oh, we lost you again.
The sound went out again.
Titus Andronicus, you'll sound again.
There you are.
Okay, sorry. About halfway through the play, Marcus makes an appeal for unity. And he says, let me teach you how to sew together these scattered limbs or knit these. He uses a metaphor of the sheaths of corn, and he says, let me teach you how to knit them into one sheath. And so to make Titus Andronicus a play about reconciliation after violence, which it's not, they had to take those lines and turn them into the final lines from the play. So to me, this serves as an interesting warning around what happens when you try to make Shakespeare's plays work as national allegories. Likewise, if one's talking about Julius Caesar or Coriolanus or Macbeth, which famously was turned into Umabata, the Zulu Macbeth, in the 1970s and had a rerun in South Africa a couple of years ago, the plays don't quite match the national context or the national history. So either you have to do a disservice to the national story, or you have to rejig the play. And so...
There it goes again.
I think
both... there you go.
And in terms of the question of trying to match Shakespeare to a particular national context, even though I'm always looking for reasons to say this play can make sense to us in South Africa, so often we have to acknowledge the differences, and particularly the colonial history that has shaped both the story that we know as our national history and the story of Shakespeare's play, I guess we could say. So there's that constant tension between realizing that, yes, we do have a different view from the South, from the global South. My colleague at the University of Cape Town, Sandra Young, has just had a book published which is called Shakespeare in the Global South. Perspectives that come from different or national contexts. But there's another sense in which it can be quite dangerous for us to say, this is a play that works better in Africa because it means we make certain claims about what it means to be African or South African. And I suppose in a South African context, we're very cautious of the risk of stereotyping, even if it seems like a positive stereotyping. So those problems that emerge from the study of the plays are there, which is why perhaps sometimes I find myself, and I think my students are interested in retreating into seeing how Shakespeare has been borrowed or adapted or adopted by South African theatre makers or translators or political figures. And there a figure like Sol Plaatje is very interesting. He was one of the founder members of the ANC, the African National Congress, that's South Africa's ruling party today and has many problems. We won't get into that, but has a prominent role in the history of resistance against racism and oppression in South Africa. And Plaatje, of course, was the first person to translate Shakespeare's plays into an African language and have them published. So he represents a possibility for engaging with Shakespeare's plays, not as English phenomena or not as Anglophone phenomena. And that's where I think the South African experience does differ to that in the US. I was mentioning in my previous correspondence with John and Matt that there are ways in which I could say for myself and for my South African students, Shakespeare is no more nor less foreign, to use a problematic word, than he is to American students today. And I was thinking of the example of Al Pacino's film Looking for Richard, where he spends most of the film exploring and mocking American sense of how they are so far removed from medieval English history. In which case, South Africa would hardly be any further removed. And yet, the language question, I think, is interesting. And that's where, perhaps in a South African context, exploring the possibilities for understanding Shakespeare's plays in translation, and maybe even reclaiming, or at least claiming for South Africa, something of the European response to Shakespeare's plays, which is, for example, in Germany, where Shakespeare's always been German, right? For 300 or 400 years, Germans have thought of Shakespeare as unser Shakespeare in German. He's not an English playwright to German people. Likewise, in South Africa, there's the chance to think about Shakespeare's role historically, but possibly in the future as well, in not only advancing the cause of African languages, but also as being understood through translation as an African author or as a South African author. And there, I think, the broadly Anglophone environment that you have in the US, although, of course, I know that, Spanish and other languages are increasingly prominent in your classrooms, I think there's an interesting difference there. And perhaps, chatting to colleagues in Ecuador and students, there might be some resonance there around the question of Shakespeare in translation. And one of the provocations that I left with my students this morning, I'm teaching them a course on Shakespeare in translation. Even though my own language base in different South African languages is not very broad, amongst my students, we have 5 or 6 or 7 South African languages to call on. So I'm encouraging them to try and use those languages in their responses to Shakespeare and to engage with earlier translations of Shakespeare's plays. One of the theoretical points that I put to them has been made by a scholar called David Skulkwyk, who used to be the director of research at the Folger Shakespeare Library, and he's now in the UK running a program called Global Shakespeares. And he made the case, based on his experience of Shakespeare translated and performed into Afrikaans, that unless you have another language to call on in which to experience Shakespeare, you will always have, and I know this sounds, it's a sort of rhetorical exaggeration, but I'll make the point anyway. You'll always have a slightly impoverished experience of Shakespeare if you only experience him in English, because of the different understanding, the linguistic slippage between contemporary and early modern English. Whereas for audiences and for students and for readers who engage with Shakespeare's plays in languages other than English, in translation into those languages as they are used contemporary speakers, there is a more immediate affinity. And of course, QUICK-FICS is making this claim in response to, I think at the time, a visit by Peter Brook from the UK to say, you know, Shakespeare is untranslatable, and Shakespeare's poetry is destroyed if we try to modernize or update or translate it. And so QUICK-FICS says, well, let's take the opposite view and say Shakespeare must be in translation. So that for me is a very interesting facet of the experience of Shakespeare in South Africa. And it also means that if we're wanting to justify Shakespeare's place in the curriculum, paradoxically, because despite lots of talk about promoting and advancing African languages as languages of learning and teaching, or as languages of publication, in fact, unfortunately, the government's policies and the Department of Education's policies have not really been very supportive of introducing languages other than English into the classroom. And so many South Africans who have English as a second or third or fourth additional language study science, history, and other languages in English. And it's very difficult to make the case that that needs to happen in translation and to have what people refer to as translanguaging experiences in classrooms. So paradoxically, Shakespeare, as ostensibly a very British English presence, offers the opportunity, because of his South African history, to be a promoter of South African languages. And that becomes a strange way of saying maybe he does belong in the curriculum. And maybe Shakespeare and performance in particular is a way of redefining our understanding of literacy. If we're thinking about multimodal literacies, different forms of expression, different forms of communication and understanding, perhaps we can promote basic reading and writing literacy through the act of listening to and watching performances of Shakespeare's plays, particularly in translation. So those are areas that I'm interested in, but I don't want to speak on behalf of my students, because at the moment I'm basically running a class where my students are without wanting to sound unkind, they're kind of guinea pigs to this experiment. So I can't speak about it confidently. We'll have to report back on that in a few weeks or months' time. But I think those are very interesting questions. If we set those aside, then unquestionably we could say there are some plays that seem to resonate particularly in South Africa, especially the political plays. The Roman plays, because they're relentlessly political, seem to speak to that friction in South Africa between personal experience and a collective political identity, which is so much a part of everyone's experience, both under colonial history and in apartheid South Africa. And yet, as soon as we start to label a play as working better in or fitting South Africa, we're starting to make simplifications or generalizations about South Africa. So that's me sitting on the fence, I guess. Maybe that was a slightly lengthy elaboration.
I have a question I really want to ask you, because you mentioned the you had like 5 or 6 different African languages represented in your class.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if you have any sense that certain plays work better in certain African languages than other. Like there's like this language is really friendly to Macbeth or Julius Caesar or whichever play. That some plays have certain affinities for certain languages. Because I know, I mean, my only experience with South African languages is a little bit of Zulu and a little bit of Xhosa. But I know that they were 2 very different kind of tribal cultures. But I can't imagine which one, like say, okay, which play would the Zulus like, you know, or would find more amenable? Or is that even a decent question to ask?
Well, I think, so look, I mean, you know, there's a precursor to the discussion around different languages and how they are more or less suited to translation, which also has a European context, which is to think about the argument that perhaps Germanic languages whether those be German or Dutch or Flemish, might be better suited to translating Shakespeare than romantic languages or romance languages like French or Italian. And I suppose if I knew more about South African languages, I might be confident in making that distinction. But what I could say is that I think there are traditions in some South African languages of translating Shakespeare, which make those languages better suited, or at least have produced more translations. So Sol Plaatje, and this he's writing about this in 1916, refers to an experience that he had some decades prior to that, so the late 19th century, late 1800s. So he was a Setswana speaker, and he was very interested in and slightly worried by the ways in which the Setswana language was being diluted, or its idiomatic richness was being lost in a changing South African context, particularly an urbanizing context, a context of disenfranchisement and people being forced off their land, and therefore having disrupted communities. So part of his Setswana language activism was to kind of recuperate these past forms of speech in Setswana, which is why to a contemporary South African Sesotho or Setswana speaker, those are cognate languages, Plaatje's language is distant. And so that kind of undermines my earlier argument about the plays seeming to sound more familiar. But what's interesting is that Plaatje refers to a conversation he had with a Motswana chief, so a monarch within the Motswana people, whose chieftain, in other words, I suppose a kind of fellow of the court, explained to Plaatje that the chief wanted to hear more about the plays of William Tsikinya Chaka, which Tsikinya Chaka, Shake the Sword or Shake the Spear. In other words, Shakespeare already in the 19th century had a history of translation into Setswana in what we would think of as an oral culture, even if there wasn't a written record of that. So partly because of Plaatje, but also because of the generations prior to him, Setswana is a language into which Shakespeare has commonly been translated. But I don't think that's a sort of linguistically, because of a linguistic match so much as because of a history within that language, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was fascinated by the anecdote in whether it was your blog or the other article about the copy of Shakespeare's works that was passed around in prison, and how Nelson Mandela was particularly enamored of Julius Caesar and Caesar's speech, a coward dies many times before his death. That would seem to me to give Shakespeare a certain originaire, or he's been appropriated by a great hero of South African decolonization, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are some fascinating dynamics there. I suppose to start at the end, it's hard to give a perspective on this to people outside of South Africa, but there's lots of revisiting of Nelson Mandela's legacy in South Africa, so that even though, of course, he's unquestionably the national hero, not just a national hero, it's partly because he has this kind of saintly status in South Africa that nations, or some what's the word, iconoclasm, I guess we could say, of Mandela then transfers onto Shakespeare in a way. But I think what we could say about the Robben Island Shakespeare, so the copy of the collected works that was circulated amongst prisoners, political prisoners on Robben Island, what's fascinating about that, and it gives us a chance to connect to As You Like It, is that in Mandela's case, you're absolutely right. He signs alongside this passage where Julius Caesar says, "Cowards die many times before their death. The valiant never taste of death but once," which sounds a lot like what Mandela said when he was standing in the dock in the so-called treason trial, where he said, you know, I've dedicated my life to opposing white domination. I've dedicated my life to opposing black domination. It's an idea which I've lived and that I cherish and I hope to see fulfilled. But he says, if necessary, I'm willing to die for it. And of course, Mandela was in fact sentenced to death, and then he had the death sentence repealed. So it seems like those lines from Julius Caesar really speak Mandela's mind and heart. And yet, of course, Nelson Mandela is nothing like the figure of Julius Caesar. So the lines only make sense removed from the play. They don't make sense if we kind of map them back into the plot context of Julius Caesar. And I think the other side to the Robben Island Bible that interests me is contestation among including those who signed the book, as whether or not it was significant. In other words, whether or not Shakespeare did mean something to the prisoners collectively on Robben Island, or if Shakespeare was just one of various materials that were rare because prisoners had limited access to reading materials, and therefore anything that was a published text was precious. So the ANC today has gone out of its way to say we shouldn't make too much of the Robben Island Bible, whereas other people want to say this is a representation of Shakespeare. Ewan Fernie, who's written a book called Shakespeare for Freedom, says, here is the Robben Island Bible that declares Shakespeare's affinity with those who are seeking freedom. So there's interesting contestation around it, but what's fascinating is that some of the scholarship around the Bible points out that a couple of characters have signed a couple of historical figures have signed their names alongside lines from characters in As You Like It. Now, Robben Island is a prison, and was an effective prison because it is barren and offers nothing. Right? It's a windswept, joyless, ecologically dead almost space, and prisoners went there to quarry limestone and do not much else. And so, on the one hand, one could say, if a prisoner is evoking the Edenic conditions of the Forest of Arden, or is kind of harking after the comforts of nature, that's a yearning for something, for a world elsewhere that Shakespeare provides. On the other hand, it's possible that, and I'm sorry to say I can point you to some of the articles, but I don't have in mind the prisoner who did sign there, but he has in fact disavowed that and basically said they were some of the only lines that I remembered from school because that was a play that we studied, and so we were told to memorize some lines from As You Like It. So then they don't really signify in the same way. And that's very interesting to me, but it makes it, maybe I'm waffling slightly, but I'll sign off on this comment, which is that As You Like It is not a play that is commonly prescribed for study in South Africa. So we have 5 or 6 plays that are usually in circulation for school learners. Some of them have that sort of argument around their so-called relevance in South Africa. Some of them just get circulated, I guess, because that's what happens with the reproduction of curricular and educational establishments. So it's Macbeth, it's Romeo and Juliet, it's Julius Caesar, it's Othello, and one or two other, Hamlet, one or two others. And it's quite rare that As You Like It is prescribed either on a university syllabus or at school level. And that's where I'm intrigued by the focus that you seem to have on the eco-critical aspects of the play and the claims that one can make in the Anthropocene period about the insights we can gather into the either artificial or accurate kind of human natural divide, and to think about the ways in which the play can be reclaimed for a South African context. Where, of course, if we're thinking in a global sense about climate change and the consequences of climate change and ecological destruction, it affects everyone around the world, but partly because it's got a huge coastline, and partly because we know that environmental change has its most severe effect on those who are impoverished. That's even though there are 1,000 things we could worry about in South Africa, from political instability to economic decline to concerns around safety and security and material deprivation of lots of the population. In fact, like the rest of the world, our greatest concern actually is ecological in the medium to long term. And so we can, if we're thinking about questions of relevance, maybe a play like As You Like It, needs to make a comeback in South Africa.
What do you think about that, Matt?
Well, why don't I let my students respond? I chose the play because it fits in well with the formal aspect of comedy, tragedy, pastoral, and all that, but I'm teaching it in an environment and literature class because Ecuador seems to be on the front lines of ecological happenings, I guess I would say. A lot of our students study environment. We have an environment studies major. None of my students is an English major. Many of them are biology majors. So why don't I ask them what they think about reading As You Like It as an ecological play? Anyone? You wrote about this stuff.
I can think As You Like It as an ecological play because I mean, it translates all the characters, all of the characters to the second world, which is the forest, in which, I mean, everyone can be like as they want, as you like it. I mean. So, I mean, I found that ecologically, and people who they're in the forest seem to do things to survive and have this connection with with the forest that you don't have in the first world, that is the city. So I really find this really interesting how, I mean, translated to our lives, I mean, how we always try to find this peaceful place, this natural place that, I mean, we once belonged. And that's what I can take from this play actually, how the forest or how nature allows us to be free of mind, of spirit, and have like no social constructions and all those things that might be like a problem in the actual times.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, and in Ecuador, I think it's important too because, for example, right now we are kind of in a winter season, and recently there were some floodings, and it was really bad, and it happened here in the city, and that was mainly because we are destroying the forests that surround here where we live, that's Quito. And so I think it applies because what you do in the second world is connected to what happens at the end in the first world. And that's ecology, basically everything is connected.
Thank you. Anyone else? If you don't mind, since we have you and you just gave that nice talk, maybe I could ask my students, how is Shakespeare perceived in Ecuador? Is it perceived as sort of an English-speaking Anglican, hegemonic, sort of second conquistadors of Ecuador? I mean, this school where I teach is a lot of the classes are taught in English, and all of our students study English. So I'm just curious what the perception is, or even of like Cervantes. Is he still seen as something you must read because of the colonial heritage, or is it something that people actually like?
So, well, I believe that here in Ecuador we have more of a Spanish influence, as we were a Spanish colony. So I think that Shakespeare comes in a second hand, as it comes after the read of the El Quijote and every these Spanish texts. So I think here in Ecuador, Shakespeare is not as read as in other countries. Yeah.
Do you think it would? I tried to get you to talk about this last time. Do you think that Shakespeare would be well received, either written or as a performance in, let's say, native peoples in the Amazons, or we call it the Oriente here, and how that would maybe translate, or even in the Sierra, many people speak a language called Quichua, and I'm just curious how some of the themes from this play might be translated to them.
Great shirt on, who wants to talk?
I'm sorry?
There's a fellow behind you with a gray shirt on.
Oh,
at the very, yeah, he was wanting to say something, and I just wanted to point that out in case you couldn't see him because he was behind your head.
Oh, thanks.
Well, I don't think that it will be welcomed in the native with the native people, because their point of view of the world, they don't look like as a monarchy in any way. They just live in a political system that is made based in patriarchy or matriarchy only. So they don't have dukes, kings, or knights. They just people, farmers. They just have workers. They just have soldiers. So they don't see the world as the European point of view. They see the world as a more ecological point of view, where they feel more connected with the nature, and they always have been there, so they don't need to transform themselves in order to survive. They have always been there. They always be there, and they live that way. And for example, I don't think they will be will view the fight between the brothers, the boys, because in this country, the indigenous people respect each other all and think the family is the more important thing in the world. So I don't think that it will be welcome in the education.
Well, I think, they are interested in a different type of knowledge. They have this really rich culture in, I don't know, medicinal plants and how nature works, and that's what they know, and that's why, that's what they're interested in. So I don't think, maybe taking this play and translating it to different languages will be, the best thing to do, because they have different interests and they have, I don't know, let's say different problems to take in considerance. So I don't think, they, I don't know, maybe they need to fight against, I don't know, oil exploitation, they will know, they were not, I don't think they will be interested in reading this kind of play while having other, like, significant problems to them, like literally attacking their populations. So.
I'm curious what Chris has to say about that, because it sounds like something that you've been talking about too. How do you get South Africans who are facing so many personal exigencies interested in something that's probably a white liberal foreign set of consequences or ideas rather?
Responds that I need to inform you that I've got about 5 minutes left here before my students have to leave. So I just want to give you a ballpark so you know how long we can continue for. Go ahead, Chris. And anybody who's got something to say before you leave, try and get a word in edgewise if you can.
Well, yeah, can I just...
Oh, sorry, yeah?
Mentioned that it affects really poor communities more, and that's why it's so important for South Africans, maybe because there are more like poor people in that country. I don't know.
Yeah. I think so what's interesting to me is one of I'm sorry, I didn't catch the student's name, and you're just off my screen. Oh no, in maths class.
Okay. Hearing
about the Ecuadorian context and the fact that, in fact, if we transplant Shakespeare's play directly into an Ecuadorian context, audiences might not want to or be persuaded by the connection between an early modern English semi-urbanizing anxiety around the relationship between humans and nature, when they have much more acute concerns and would want a story that speaks more immediately to their context. And for me, the question that raises is, people would use the word fidelity. I suppose that's problematic, but how much Shakespeare there needs to be in something that we call Shakespeare? In other words, how many liberties can one take when adapting a text, adapting a story? And at a certain point, if you adapt it so closely to a particular context, when does it cease to become Shakespeare? And what happens when we dispense with that label? And of course, there's precedent for this in Shakespeare himself, who would not always have felt that his audiences needed to either say, we know where this story that you've borrowed comes from, or we think this is a new story to us, but actually Shakespeare's taken it from a pre-existing set of mythologies or histories or writers, or this is our own history and we recall it. So there are different ways in which plays can work, sometimes for the sake of escapism, sometimes because they really speak to local issues. But I'm interested in what happens when we say, for example, in a South African context, one of the texts that my students will be engaging with this term is called Quasi-Denge, translated into English as Hill of Fools. And it's based on a love story, a rivalry between families in the Xhosa-speaking part of the Eastern Cape. And of course, things end badly, and the community is torn by strife, and the lovers die. So we want to say it's a Romeo and Juliet story. And the author said, this is my version of Romeo and Juliet. But if you weren't primed by the claim that Romeo and Juliet is the precursor to the story, you wouldn't think of it as a Romeo and Juliet story. So what happens when we attach the Shakespearean label to something? You know, if the Romeo and Juliet story is actually an archetype that pre-exists Shakespeare. So with the question of As You Like It in Ecuador, I wonder if an Ecuadorian theater company were to perform a play that was about two brothers in an oil corporation who were contesting, shares in the company, and had to confront an environment that was both a very threatening, environment and one that seemed to provide comfort. I mean, that's really the basics of Shakespeare's play. And if we adapt that into an Ecuadorian context and speak specifically about oil or problems of climate in Ecuador, do we still need to have the label of Shakespeare? And what happens when we dispense with that label? So those are interesting considerations that come out of that comment for me.
So Chris and Matt, I'm really sorry to end this conversation, but it's time for us.
Yeah, we have to go. I don't know whether they can continue on their own.
I mean, I have to go, Matt.
Are you essential for the connection between Ecuador and South Africa?
I think so.
Oh.
So
I unfortunately probably have to for traffic as well. So.
I learned a lot from you today, Chris, and also from the students in Ecuador over the last 2 weeks, and my old friend Matt Dolloff. So thank you all. We have to leave. We wish we could last longer.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to chat.
Bye, guys.
I apologize for taking up lots of the talking time.
Okay. All right. Take care, everybody.
Cheers. Thank you.